Welcome. This is a story that journeys across continents and into the quiet chambers of power, exploring the weight of leadership, the nature of conflict, and the enduring, complex pursuit of peace. It is a narrative woven from the threads of faith, duty, and the stark realities of a world grappling with suffering. At its heart lies a moment of profound contrast, a collision of worlds that shook assumptions and revealed difficult truths. A moment encapsulated by a headline that captured the tension, yet only hinted at the deeper story. Pope Francis begs Traoré to stop his war. Traoré's reply left the Vatican stunned. This is the story behind that moment. A story of two burdens and the unyielding soil of human conflict that lie in the serene, ancient heart of the Vatican, a world away from the dust and conflict zones. Pope Francis carried a burden invisible to most. It was the collective ache of humanity, a constant, low thrum beneath the surface of his daily duties. The polished floors, the hushed reverence, the timeless art, they were beautiful, yes, but they also served as a stark contrast to the harsh realities that occupied his thoughts and prayers. His mind, his heart, were often far from Rome, reaching out to those who suffered. Lately, a particular corner of the world had settled heavy upon his soul, Burkina Faso. The reports arriving from that West African nation were increasingly grim. They spoke of terror, displacement, a spiral of violence that seemed to defy resolution. He saw the numbers, thousands killed, millions displaced, but behind the statistics, he saw faces. He imagined the fear in a child's eyes, the despair of a mother who had lost her home, the quiet resignation in the stance of an elder who had seen too much war. He would spend hours in his private chapel, the only sound the soft murmur of his prayers, sometimes punctuated by a sigh that carried the weight of the world. He felt a deep spiritual connection to the people of Africa, their vibrant faith, their resilience. To see them subjected to such brutality tore at him. He read letters from local bishops, missionaries, aid workers, voices from the ground describing the palpable fear, the collapsing social structures, the desperate need for peace. His reflection was not merely political, it was profoundly spiritual. He saw the conflict as a manifestation of deeper human brokenness, fueled by greed, injustice, and a lack of recognition of shared humanity. He thought of the gospel call to be peacemakers, to intervene, to speak truth to power, however uncomfortable that might be. He felt an insistent call to do something, to reach out across the vast distance, geographical, cultural, political, that separated his world from the crucible of Burkina Faso. Discussions with his advisors were careful, measured. They spoke of diplomacy, of geopolitical factors, of the delicate balance of international relations. But the Pope kept bringing them back to the human cost. How can we speak of hope, he would ask, his voice gentle yet firm, cutting through the geopolitical analysis, if we do not actively pursue peace for those who are losing everything? Politics is necessary, yes, but our first call is pastoral. It is a call to recognize the face of Christ in the suffering of the poor and the vulnerable. He spoke of the gospel imperative to be peacemakers, to reach out even to those who seem distant or difficult to engage. He knew the complexities. He knew the new leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré, had come to power through force, a stark figure in military fatigues, promising security through decisive action. He embodied the harsh realities of a nation battling for survival. Engaging with him directly carried risks, raised questions. But the image of suffering people, the silent cries echoing in his heart, outweighed these concerns. The spiritual imperative to act was too strong that he felt a profound sense of empathy, not just for the victims, but even in a complex way, for the leader who bore the crushing weight of responsibility in such a crisis. What did it feel like, he wondered, to hold the fate of millions in your hands amidst chaos? To be tasked with protecting them when the threats were so pervasive and brutal? He prayed for President Traoré too, for wisdom, for a softening of the heart, for the possibility of choosing a different path. The idea began to form, quiet at first, then growing into a firm resolution. He would send a direct, personal message. Not a formal diplomatic note alone, but something more personal, more spiritual. A handwritten letter from the Pope himself, perhaps carried by a trusted emissary. It would be a message stripped of pretense, raw in its sincerity, begging for the violence to stop, for a recognition of the shared dignity of all lives. It was a gamble, an act of faith in the possibility that even in the most hardened situations, a call from the heart could find resonance. He would be Traoré to stop his war. The word was deliberate, chosen for its vulnerability, its earnestness, its total lack of pride or political calculation. It was the plea of a shepherd for his scattered flock. The weight of this decision settled upon him, a heavy, yet purposeful, burden, thousands of miles away, under a sky that often felt too vast and indifferent. Captain Ibrahim Traoré lived a reality that was a world away from gilded domes and quiet chapels. His days were a relentless cycle of security briefings, strategic meetings, visiting troops on the front lines, and grappling with the crushing weight of leadership in a nation under siege. Sleep was a luxury, peace a distant dream. His world was defined by dust, the smell of diesel and wood smoke, the tense silence before an attack, and the grim aftermath. His uniform was not a symbol of status, but a practical necessity, a constant reminder of the war that consumed his nation. He was young, but the burden he carried had etched lines of fatigue and grim determination onto his face. He saw suffering daily, not in reports, but in the eyes of displaced families huddled in makeshift camps, in the empty spaces where villages once stood, in the quiet grief of soldiers who had lost comrades. The enemy was elusive, brutal, showing no mercy. They attacked indiscriminately, targeting civilians, schools, markets, anything that represented the fragile order he was trying to protect. He had stepped into this role because he believed it was necessary. The nation was bleeding, he and his fellow officers felt. Previous leadership had failed to contain the threat, had perhaps become too reliant on external support that came with unacceptable strings attached or proved ineffective against the evolving insurgency. His rise to power was chaotic, born of urgency and a fierce conviction that only a radical shift could save Burkina Faso. His perspective was shaped by the immediate, existential threat. Talk of dialogue felt naive when confronted with an enemy that massacred those who weren't loyal to them. Talk of external aid often felt like a continuation of dependence, a compromise of the very sovereignty they were fighting to protect. He felt a deep, almost visceral, pride in the Burkinabe people, their resilience, their capacity to fight for themselves. This pride was intertwined with a fierce determination that his nation should stand on its own feet, charting its own course. Dignity, for him, was not an abstract concept of human rights taught in universities far away. Dignity was the right of a farmer to cultivate his land without fear of being murdered. Dignity was the capacity of the nation to defend its borders and its people by its own means. Dignity was refusing to be a perpetual ward of external powers, dependent on aid and advice that often missed the mark. He saw the current fight, brutal as it was, as a necessary step towards reclaiming that dignity. He was aware of the international gaze upon him, the scrutiny from capitals far and wide, including the Vatican. He knew he was seen by some as a military strongman, by others as a potential savior. The weight of these perceptions was secondary to the weight of the conflict itself, the lives on the line every single day. He sometimes received messages from international bodies, religious leaders, diplomats. They often spoke in language that seemed detached from his reality, calls for restraint that felt impossible when his soldiers were being ambushed, appeals for dialogue that felt futile when the enemy's only language seemed to be violence. Yet, he was also a man who carried the traditions of his nation, traditions often imbued with faith and respect for elders and moral authority. He knew of the Pope, his global standing, his message of peace. A part of him, perhaps a part buried deep beneath the layers of military necessity and strategic calculation, registered the significance of such a figure reaching out. But the immediate, pressing reality of the war, the faces of the suffering, the responsibility he felt towards his fighting men, these were the forces that shaped his decisions, that dictated his path. His ground was the unyielding soil of a nation fighting for its life, and his burden was the terrible, necessary task of leading that fight. He awaited whatever message might come, through the filter of this harsh, immediate reality. Back in the quiet world of the Vatican, the decision to send a direct message solidified. The form it would take was meticulously considered. Not a formal diplomatic note, which could be perceived as purely political, but something more personal, more spiritual. A handwritten letter from the Pope himself, perhaps carried by a trusted emissary. Cardinal Michael O'Connell, a close advisor known for his wisdom and understanding of African affairs, was part of the core group drafting the message. "It must come from the heart, Holy Father," he advised. "It cannot sound like a political demand, but a human plea. A shepherd calling out to another leader who bears a heavy responsibility, reminding him of the ultimate shepherd." The word begs was chosen deliberately for the internal framing of the message. It wasn't to be written in the letter itself in such stark terms, but it defined the spirit of the communication, a plea born of humility and deep concern, stripping away hierarchical distance. The letter itself would be eloquent, reflecting the Pope's compassionate voice, speaking of the shared human family, the sanctity of life, the tragic waste of war, and the potential for courage in choosing the path of peace. A small, symbolic gift was chosen, a simple, hand-carved olive wood dove, a universal symbol of peace. It was small enough to be held in the palm, a tangible reminder of the message. The Pope himself held it, praying over it, imbuing it with his hopes and intentions. "Let it be a seed," he murmured, carried into difficult soil. Archbishop Paolo Bertone, seasoned diplomat with a calm demeanor and a reputation for navigating complex missions, was chosen as the emissary. He was briefed extensively, not just on the political situation, but on the human dimensions of the crisis. His mission was to deliver the letter and the gift, to convey the depth of the Holy Father's concern with sincerity, and most importantly, to listen. To understand as much as possible the reality from President Traoré's perspective. There was a sense of anticipation within the Vatican, a mixture of hope and trepidation. They were sending a message of radical peace into a situation defined by radical violence. Would it be received? Would it have any impact? Or would it be just another voice in the storm, easily ignored? The preparation of the message and the dispatch of the emissary were carried out with quiet determination. There was no public announcement, preserving the personal nature of the appeal. The hopes were high, rooted in faith, but tempered by a pragmatic understanding of the immense challenges. They were building a bridge across worlds, uncertain if it would hold the weight of the message it carried. The prayer was that the spirit of the appeal, the fact that Pope Francis BEGS Traoré to stop his war, might somehow pierce through the armor of military necessity and find a resonant chord in the president's heart. In Ouagadougou, life continued its tense rhythm. Security remained the overriding concern. President Traoré and his inner circle were consumed by the daily management of the war, planning operations, securing supply routes, dealing with the aftermath of attacks, and maintaining control in a volatile political landscape. Sleep was a luxury, peace a distant dream. Word reached the presidential palace that an emissary was expected from the Vatican. The news was received with interest, and perhaps a degree of wariness. The Vatican held moral authority, yes, but what practical help could they offer? Would this be another form of external pressure, cloaked in religious language? Yielding power of mercy. Discussions among Traoré's advisors reflected the varied perspectives within his government. Some saw it as an opportunity to engage with a significant global figure, perhaps garnering some form of international understanding or even legitimacy. Others were deeply skeptical, viewing the Vatican, like many international institutions, as out of touch with the brutal realities on the ground, prone to offering idealistic solutions that wouldn't stop a single bullet or save a single life. Traoré himself received the news with his usual reserved demeanor. He instructed his staff to receive the archbishop with courtesy and respect. He acknowledged the Pope's status, but his primary focus remained on the immediate security challenges. Any message from the Vatican would be weighed against the backdrop of the daily struggle for survival. He thought about the concept of peace. It was a word used often in international forums, a goal everyone claimed to desire. But what did it mean here, in a country where entire regions were under threat, where the enemy actively sought to impose a reign of terror? Could peace be achieved by negotiation with those who refused to negotiate? Could it be achieved by laying down arms when facing an enemy determined to kill? His nights were filled with strategizing, his days with the grim consequences of the ongoing conflict. The faces of soldiers he had visited, the stoic suffering of civilians, these were the images that filled his mind, far more immediate than abstract discussions of global morality. His reality was one of necessity, of difficult choices made under immense pressure, of a constant weighing of risks and consequences measured in human lives. He prepared himself to receive the emissary. He would listen respectfully to the Pope's message. But his response would be dictated by the reality he lived, the responsibility he felt, and the path he genuinely believed was the only one that could lead his nation to a place where true, secure peace might one day be possible. The bridge of hope was being built from afar, but it would land on ground hardened by war, where necessity often trumped idealism. He would engage, yes, but on his own terms, from the perspective forged in the fire and dust of his unyielding ground. The meeting took place in a room that seemed to hold its breath. Archbishop Bertone, calm and composed, represented the quiet strength of the Vatican's moral authority. President Traoré, still in his military fatigues, embodied the raw, immediate power of a nation fighting for its existence. The contrast was palpable, a visual representation of the two worlds converging. Archbishop Bertone began by conveying the Holy Father's personal greetings and his profound respect for the burdens of leadership. He then presented the handwritten letter, sealed with the Vatican crest, and the small, polished stone that carried the Pope's prayers. He spoke with sincere emotion, his voice measured but warm, relaying the Pope's deep sorrow for the suffering of the Burkinabe people. That he explained the letter's purpose, a direct, heartfelt appeal from a shepherd to a leader, urging a shift in course, a prioritization of peace, a commitment to protecting the innocent. He articulated the Pope's message, emphasizing that it came from a place of love and universal concern, not political agenda. He conveyed the spirit of the Pope's plea, that Pope Francis begs Traoré to stop his war, framing it as a spiritual imperative to end the bloodshed and seek dialogue. He spoke of the courage required to choose the path of peace, the potential for reconciliation, the healing power of mercy. As the Archbishop spoke, he watched Traoré closely. The president listened intently, his gaze fixed on the Archbishop's face, occasionally glancing at the letter or the stone resting on the table. His expression remained controlled, revealing little of his internal state. The air in the room grew heavy with the unspoken realities of the conflict raging outside. When the Archbishop finished, a silence fell. It stretched, filled with the weight of the Pope's heartfelt plea and the silent, immense pressure bearing down on the president. The rhythmic ticking of a clock in the room seemed unusually loud. Then, President Traoré spoke. He began formally, acknowledging the Holy Father's global standing and expressing gratitude for the message and the gift. His voice was calm, deliberate. "Your Excellency," he said, "please assure His Holiness that his concern for the suffering of my people is felt deeply here. It is the very reason for the struggle we are engaged in." But then his tone shifted. It was not a sudden change to hostility, but a quiet, firm anchoring in his own reality. He picked up the polished stone, turning it over in his fingers as he spoke, a small, smooth object contrasting with the rough texture of his uniform. "You speak of stopping the war," Traoré said, his gaze lifting from the stone to meet the Archbishop's eyes directly. "We yearn for peace. But peace, for us, is not an option available to us now. Not in the way His Holiness means." He spoke of the nature of the enemy, their refusal to engage in dialogue, their brutality. "Stopping our defense," he stated with chilling clarity, "is not stopping the war. It is surrendering our people to massacre. It is allowing the locusts to consume everything." He used the same analogy he had used with his advisors, a stark agricultural metaphor for the existential threat. He spoke of the burden of responsibility, the faces of the victims and the soldiers that filled his days and nights. "My duty," he said, his voice low but intense, "is to protect my people, to ensure they have a future on their own land. And that duty, today, requires us to fight." He spoke of sovereignty, of the historical experience of his nation. "For too long, others have told us how to live, how to defend ourselves. We are doing this ourselves now. It is a terrible price, but it is a price paid for the right to exist, for the dignity of standing on our own feet." His reply was not a fiery rejection, but a cold, hard articulation of necessity as he perceived it. He was not dismissing peace as an ideal, but placing it out of reach in the immediate present, arguing that the path to it lay through the conflict. Tragically, Archbishop Bertone listened, absorbing the weight of each word. He recognized the genuine pain and conviction in Traoré's voice, but also the unyielding logic that seemed to close the door to the Pope's immediate appeal. The president's response was reasoned, self-consistent within his framework of leadership and necessity, and utterly devastating to the Vatican's hopes for a breakthrough. When the meeting concluded, politely but with a finality that left no room for further immediate discussion, Archbishop Bertone departed. He carried back the polished stone and the heavy knowledge of the gulf between the Pope's plea and Traoré's reality. He transmitted the reply back to the Vatican. The words, delivered with such calm certainty, landed in Rome with the force of a physical blow. Indeed, Traoré's reply left the Vatican stunned. It was a shock born not of disrespect, but of the profound, heartbreaking realization that the path to peace envisioned from Rome was, in the eyes of the man fighting the war, currently impassable, blocked by the perceived necessity of the fight itself. The impact of President Traoré's reply in the Vatican was transformative, not in shattering resolve, but in deepening understanding and reshaping approach. The initial shock, the sense that the Pope's heartfelt plea had been met with an unyielding wall of military logic, forced a period of profound introspection. The lesson in humility was stark. It was a recognition that moral authority, however globally respected, does not automatically translate into political action or a change of heart in leaders facing existential threats. It underscored the vast difference between diagnosing a problem from afar and living within its brutal reality. Traoré's articulation of dignity, rooted in self-defense and sovereignty after historical vulnerability, challenged the Vatican to understand that the concept of dignity, while universal, is interpreted through the lens of lived experience and historical context. This understanding led to a redirection of efforts. While public appeals for peace continued, the focus expanded to strengthen the foundations upon which future peace might eventually be built. This meant significantly increasing support for humanitarian efforts in Burkina Faso, providing aid to the displaced, supporting healthcare facilities, helping rebuild communities where possible. It was an acknowledgement that while the grand gesture of a papal plea might not have stopped the war, the quiet, persistent work of alleviating suffering and preserving human dignity on the ground was equally vital. The Vatican also increased its engagement with the local church in Burkina Faso. Priests, bishops, religious sisters, and lay leaders were the true heroes on the front lines of humanitarian aid and community support. They lived among the people, understood the local dynamics, and worked tirelessly for reconciliation at the grassroots level. The Vatican listened more intently to their needs and their insights, recognizing that the seeds of peace had to be cultivated within the unyielding soil of the nation itself, watered by local hands. There was also a renewed focus on global advocacy addressing the root causes of conflict that Traoré's reply had highlighted. The Pope and Vatican officials continued to speak out against the arms trade, the exploitation of African resources, and the need for more just and equitable international relations that would allow nations like Burkina Faso to thrive and secure themselves without resorting to perpetual dependence or violent self-reliance. The encounter with Traoré, symbolized by the returned polished stone and the unyielding reply, became a sober case study in the challenging realities of modern peacemaking. It taught that peace is not a destination reached by a single dramatic step, but a long, arduous journey requiring multifaceted efforts, from global moral appeals to local acts of compassion, from diplomatic engagement to addressing historical injustices and economic inequalities. The initial shock had matured into a deeper, more informed commitment to the complex, patient work of cultivating hope in arid lands. Meanwhile, in Burkina Faso, the war continued its devastating course. President Traoré remained steadfast in his conviction that his military strategy was the necessary, albeit brutal, path to security. His reply to the Pope had been a clear articulation of his position, and he continued to act upon it. His focus remained on strengthening the national armed forces, recruiting new soldiers, and launching offensives against insurgent strongholds. He continued to speak of sovereignty and self-reliance, distancing Burkina Faso from traditional Western partners and seeking new alliances he believed would better serve his nation's interests without compromising its independence. The human cost of this continued war was immense and undeniable. Despite the government's efforts, civilians remained vulnerable. Displacement continued, creating a massive humanitarian crisis. Basic services were stretched thin or non-existent in conflict zones. The cycle of violence, retaliation, and suffering persisted. Traoré felt the weight of this cost daily. The strategic maps on his walls were marked with areas of control, lines of engagement, but they could not depict the tears shed, the lives lost, the trauma inflicted. He visited hospitals filled with wounded soldiers and civilians. He met with families who had lost loved ones. These encounters fueled his resolve, reinforcing his belief that the fight was necessary to prevent even greater horrors, but they also took an immeasurable toll on him. He knew that his approach was controversial, that it was seen by some outside Burkina Faso as heavy-handed or resistant to peace. But from his perspective, steeped in the immediate reality of his nation's struggle, he was making the only choice he believed was available to him to fulfill his duty to protect his people and secure their future dignity, a dignity he felt could only be earned through their own strength. The narrative on the ground was one of grim perseverance. Communities, supported by organizations like the local church, continued to resist despair, finding ways to survive, to help each other, to keep glimmers of hope alive amidst the darkness. Their resilience, their quiet acts of courage, were another form of dignity, the dignity of enduring, of maintaining humanity in inhumane circumstances. The path forward for Burkina Faso remained steep and uncertain. Traoré continued on the course he believed was necessary, bearing the immense weight of his leadership and the ongoing cost of the war. The unyielding soil of the nation continued to be a battleground, where seeds of conflict and seeds of hope struggled for dominance. The story of Pope Francis's plea and Ibrahim Traoré's reply is ultimately a story about dignity, viewed through different lenses and pursued through vastly different means. The inspirational narrative with moral core style finds its heart in exploring this contrast and the lessons it offers. Pope Francis embodied a dignity rooted in spiritual truth, the inherent worth of every soul, demanding compassion, reconciliation, and peace as the highest ideals. His plea was an invitation to recognize this universal dignity and act accordingly, believing in the transformative power of turning away from violence. President Traoré, shaped by a history of external influence and a present of existential threat, embodied a dignity rooted in national sovereignty, self-reliance, and the perceived necessity of defending one's own against overwhelming force. His reply was an assertion of this dignity, arguing that it had to be earned through struggle to be truly secure. The stunning aspect was the collision of these two perspectives. Not a clash of good versus evil, but a tragic confrontation between different understandings of duty and survival in a world scarred by injustice and conflict. The moral core lies in the reflection this collision provokes. It teaches humility, that understanding the path to peace requires listening to and attempting to comprehend realities profoundly different from our own, even when they are difficult to accept. It highlights the complexities of identity, the tension between a universal human identity calling for solidarity and national identities demanding self-preservation and sovereignty. It is a story that inspires, not through a miraculous happy ending, but through the sheer perseverance of those who continue to work for peace and alleviate suffering in the face of immense obstacles. It inspires through the willingness of figures like Pope Francis to make vulnerable, heartfelt pleas, and through the enduring resilience of people like those in Burkina Faso who maintain their humanity amidst brutality. The encounter did not end the war, but it illuminated the profound challenges inherent in doing so. It revealed that achieving lasting peace requires not only addressing the symptoms of conflict but also confronting its deep roots in history, injustice, and competing perceptions of dignity and necessity. The initial headline, Pope Francis begs Traoré to stop his war, Traoré's reply left the Vatican stunned. Captured a moment of collision, but the true narrative is the ongoing, difficult, yet essential work of seeking understanding, cultivating hope, and relentlessly pursuing peace, recognizing dignity in all its complex and sometimes heartbreaking forms, even in the unyielding soil of conflict zones. The path to peace is not a sprint, it is a marathon across broken ground, often uphill, under a heavy sky. The encounter between Pope Francis and President Traoré did not instantly mend the fractures in Burkina Faso, nor did it provide the Vatican with a simple formula for resolving complex conflicts. Instead, it left behind a deeper understanding of the immense challenges, a renewed sense of urgency, and a commitment to the long, painstaking work that peace requires. The initial shock that had gripped the Vatican in the wake of Traoré's reply gradually transformed into a quiet, resolute determination. The message was clear: dramatic appeals were necessary as moral statements, but they were not sufficient. True peacebuilding required persistent, multifaceted effort, often far from the headlines. The Vatican continued its support for the local church in Burkina Faso, recognizing its vital role. Caritas Burkina Faso and other church-affiliated organizations, alongside numerous other humanitarian groups, were on the front lines, providing food, shelter, medical care, and education to those displaced by the conflict. Their work was an embodiment of the Pope's message, a practical application of the call to compassion and human dignity. These were the quiet heroes, working daily to mend the fabric of society, one act of kindness at a time. Efforts were also made to support interfaith dialogue initiatives. In a country with significant Muslim and Christian populations, where extremist groups sought to sow religious division, the work of faith leaders coming together to preach tolerance, understanding, and shared humanity was crucial. The Vatican encouraged and supported these bridges being built at the community level, recognizing that religious harmony was essential for national cohesion and a prerequisite for lasting peace. Globally, Pope Francis did not cease his advocacy. Drawing on the lessons learned from the encounter with Traoré, his calls for peace were often accompanied by condemnations of the global systems that fuel conflict: the arms trade, economic inequality, the exploitation of resources, and the lack of genuine solidarity with vulnerable nations. He continued to emphasize that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice and the conditions under which all people can live with dignity and security. The encounter with Traoré provided a concrete, vivid illustration of the real-world consequences of these global failures. The story of the plea and the reply became, in a sense, a touchstone within the Vatican, a reminder of the complexities they faced in their mission for peace. It was discussed in diplomatic circles, reflected upon in theological discussions, and served as a point of reference when engaging with other conflict situations. It underscored the necessity of combining spiritual conviction with a humble, pragmatic understanding of political realities and historical contexts. President Traoré continued to lead Burkina Faso through its difficult struggle. His path remained focused on military solutions and the assertion of sovereignty. The war continued to exact a heavy toll on the nation. Whether his approach would ultimately lead to the security and dignity he sought remained a question only time and history could answer. The polished stone, carried from Rome to Ouagadougou and back, sat on a desk in the Vatican, a silent witness to the encounter. It symbolized the enduring call for peace, but also the hard ground it had landed upon. The olive wood dove, presented to Traoré, remained in the presidential palace, perhaps a faint echo of a different possibility amidst the noise of war. The inspirational narrative with moral core, style finds its final note in this long horizon. Inspiration comes not just from moments of triumph, but from the persistent, often unseen, efforts undertaken despite setbacks. It comes from the dignity of those who suffer and endure, the humility of those who learn from difficult truths, and the unwavering commitment of those who, like the shepherd, continue to pray and work for peace, knowing that the path is long, the soil is often unyielding, but the cultivation of hope is always necessary.